Let's, I think let's start. I apologize for the delay. It's just traffic in Rome gets crazy when it rains. So it's an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome everybody to this Reconnect conference within the framework Horizon 2020. And thanks everybody for being here. In particular, let me thank President Giuliano Amato for having accepted our invitation to deliver the keynote speech. I think this conference is really right on target in terms of timing with the, can you hear me? With the research strategy that we are setting up in Lewis. The keyword that we use for our strategic plan is actually an engaged research, meaning a research that actually is relevant, talks to society, and has the ambition to make society a better place, whatever that means. So let me be clear on this. I'm a prorector for research, so this is what I'm in charge for. And I truly believe that we are in this business because of intellectual curiosity, first of all. I truly believe, as Galileo in Bertolt Brecht's drama at some point says, I must understand, I must know, and this is actually why we have chosen to be here. So intellectual curiosity is our first engine that motivates us to work. But at the same time, I think more and more society is asking us to be accountable, to also deliver something that can contribute to the improvement, the quality of life of our societies. So this is why I think this research is really, really perfect, I think. The three keywords I've read on the program, legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty, are really at the center of what we should obsess with as researchers nowadays. Trying to understand what went wrong with the European project in terms of how it is perceived by the European citizens, I can really think at not many other questions as relevant as this one. We know that in history teaches us that when countries start facing inward, that's the perfect first ingredient for a recipe for disaster. So I really think that this project can really give an important contribution to improve the functioning of our European project. So welcome again, and I wish you a nice day of work.
Good morning, everyone. Dear colleagues, friends, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you all at Lewis in Rome and to this first Reconnect workshop. It's not my intention, neither my role here to deliver a talk, but let me just share with you a couple of thoughts and presumably a deep and warm thanks to all the people that have been working so hard during the last weeks to make this workshop possible. Many of them are here. Most of them are young collaborators, and it is really a pleasure to have them in our team. The two thoughts are very simple, if you want, but I'm firmly convinced that it is important to have them in mind. In times when people are, ready to open to the idea to build walls, we have in our mind bridges. And I think that in this respect, even though it is a simple idea, this is exactly the principle and, the horizon that has inspired the universities that have accepted to be in the consortium of Reconnect. The second thought is about the epistemology that is at the very basis of our, 4-year project. For many of us, the knowledge that is qualified as a scientific, sound and valid knowledge is in the doctrine, is in the books, is in what is elaborated by scholars. And here we want to have a bridge between the knowledge elaborated by, say, scientists and the knowledge that is handled and produced by practitioners and people. So in this respect, there is also a reconnection from the epistemological point of view within the project that I think can enrich our view of the European Union and the people in the EU. This is all for me, at least for now. It is my pleasure to leave the floor to our reconnecting coordinator, which is Professor Ian Wouters. Thank you so much for being here with all of us.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure and honor to be back in Rome at this distinguished university and to basically be able to share with you some thoughts on our Reconnect project, which indeed is about building bridges, as Daniela very aptly just said. I'm going to set the scene, if I may, with just a short presentation about the main questions that we tackle in our project, but also about the main questions we want to tackle today in our workshop. So let me just say a couple of things about the Reconnect project first. As you may have seen on the first slide, we have a lot of logos there, and that's of course because we have a lot of partners. It's a Horizon 2020 project. The full name is Reconciling Europe with its citizens through democracy and rule of law. You know, you always need acronyms in the European Union, so we decided to make it Reconnect. It's a large project, 18 partners from 14 countries. We have the honor in Leuven, with our Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, to coordinate the project. And I should also stress that Louis is a core partner in the project, and I really would like to thank the whole Louis team for its great participation in the project. In the first place, Professor Leonardo Morlino, who is not able to be with us today and who apologizes for this. But we have, of course, the great pleasure of having with us today Daniela, Raffaele, Cristina, Nicola, Giovanni, and all these bright young people that have been also recruited to make the Louis team even stronger than it already was. A few words about the Reconnect project. It's a 4-year multidisciplinary research project, and it starts off basically with a kind of finding of a mood of crisis. And before I go into this mood of crisis, I should do what I always like to do, quote my favorite article of the EU Treaty, which is Article 2 of the EU Treaty. Just to say that it all started so nicely with the great work of the Convention on the Future of Europe and this wonderful nutshell provision, which displays the kind of ideal type of society and the deep fundamental foundational values that the European Union wants to stand for. So, I mean, it's a great sentence. It really highlights that we are founded on a number of fundamental values, including democracy and the rule of law, but it also highlights, and I want to come back to that in my presentation, a number of other principles when it says that these values are common to the member states in a society in which a number of principles prevail, including solidarity and justice. Very important for our project. I will come back to that in a moment. So, but that's great. That's the living law, if I may say so, since the 1st of December 2009 with the Lisbon Treaty that entered into force. But strangely enough, a little bit before the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, dark clouds started to gather in the European sky. And in a way, the dark clouds have never really gone away anymore since then. We had a succession of crises. The EU got in a kind of state of turmoil, a kind of crisis mode, which has more or less become the new normal, if I may say so. We had a financial economic crisis, collapse of Lehman Brothers. That crisis translated also in the so-called Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, which shook really Europe to its core. We had the migration crisis, which in a certain way is still with us, and which also gave rise to a lot of tensions, especially also within that perspective of solidarity and burden sharing in the European Union. We have security issues with many terrorist attacks and the question how to tackle those internal and external security threats today. And we have rule of law backsliding, which is, of course, one of the core topics of the Reconnect project. And I should, of course, add that we have Brexit, but that is not the core topic of our research, although I think it's a very important additional crisis that basically links to a lot of issues that we have to investigate as part of the Reconnect project. So what do we see with that state of turmoil and those successive, but not just successive, they're also in parallel coexisting crises in the European Union? We see an erosion of the authority and the legitimacy of the European Union. More than that, there is a widespread perception that the EU is not fair, that its policy recipes that it developed, partly also to address those crises, such as the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone, such as the migration crisis and so on, that its policy recipes are not necessarily fair or just, and that there is too little solidarity in the European Union. Again, that is what we are currently seeing among perceptions of citizens, and this is really flying in the face of one of those, say, things that are highlighted in Article 2, the solidarity and justice theme. So I come to the core questions we want to address under the Reconnect project. Our core questions are basically this: how can European governance become more firmly rooted in justice and solidarity? How can they regain authority and legitimacy? And how can we renew trust and recognition with our citizens? In other words, how can we reconnect? How can we build bridges between European governance and our populations? So, what are we going to do under the project? It's a very bold project, and we also know that expectations are very high. When we had our kickoff conference in July last year in Brussels, the final words were for the director of DG Research of the Commission, really highlighting how high the expectations are with regard to the, say, achievements of our project. Well, the objective is to basically make a comprehensive and integrated multidisciplinary examination of principles, practices, and perceptions of democracy and the rule of law in the EU and its member states. That's a big thing. And that also explains why we need 18 partners and all their methodologies and skills and expertise. So the question is, under what conditions can democracy and the rule of law, when deepened, lead to new forms of authority and legitimacy of the Union? I should also stress that our project, while of course being firstly founded on strong conceptual work, which is also what partly this workshop is about, our project is also an empirical project. And we have 4 major case studies that I will come back to, namely economic and fiscal governance, counterterrorism, migration, and trade. So let me first go into basically a few thoughts about the topic of today, authority and legitimacy. We can, of course, discuss the whole day about the actual definition and the actual dimensions of these terms. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to say how I understand those things and actually also how we put them down in the research proposal that we submitted with the European Commission and that fortunately won the grant. Authority if I may just use as a working definition, we see it as the delegated competence to exercise power. Interestingly, of course, the lawyers will talk immediately about conferred competences, the principle of conferral, the way in which you exercise those competences, think of subsidiarity, proportionality, and so on. Doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for political scientists. So we have to also, at our workshop, try to bridge, not just some of the things we want to bridge, but also, let's say, the discourses and conceptual frameworks between multiple scientific disciplines. Legitimacy, again, a concept that you can have very long discussions about. We tend to see it here just as the morally justified exercise of power. Of course, there are lots of distinctions and nuances you can make, but we have excellent panels, excellent presentations in the making today, so I will leave it to the next presenters in that respect. What we already know is that both this authority and this legitimacy are existentially challenged in the EU, and that it has to do something with the unique nature, the lawyers would say sui generis nature, of the European Union, and the multi-level system of governance of the European Union. Multi-level governance, again, something which has been very much a hype in scholarship over the past decades. Let us just say that, yes, we know it's a complex structure with, say, all kinds of both horizontal and vertical dimensions. I will come back to that in a moment. But let me also stress that we are here in a very complex kind of triangular relationship between notions such as sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy. And sovereignty, if it ever was a way, it's definitely back. Sovereignty is again the buzzword in these times. We live in times that more and more, both within the EU and outside the EU, the emphasis is again on nationhood, on sovereignty, identity, what have you. But also in the European Union, sovereignty concerns remain very much alive. Think only about the calls of certain politicians for a repatriation of certain powers from the Union to the national level. So the question is indeed, to what extent can democracy, can the rule of law exist in such complex multi-level systems of governance like the EU, with large degrees of shared sovereignty? And so we increasingly observe that these key concepts, authority and legitimacy, and their place at the level of the European Union, have been challenged because of also the many crises we have been going through. And these crises have laid bare what Kathleen McNamara calls the puzzle of authority. Who does, can, and should legitimately exercise authority in this multi-level governance field? There is increasing complexity, of course. Embedded, shifting loci of authority in different policy areas and under different competences and different EU treaty provisions. I will, in a way, elucidate this with the 4 case studies I'm going to now briefly touch upon. But the point is indeed this contested legitimacy, in the end, also calls the authority, the competences of the EU into question. So the things are related to each other. A few words, if I may, about the 4 case studies we are going to conduct. Of course, these case studies were written in the project proposal when we prepared the proposal in 2016. You could easily imagine that nowadays, there are maybe a number of other problem areas, issues that have popped up in the meantime. And of course, we cannot rewrite the project as it was approved by the Commission, but it's always important, and I say this also for the partners to reconnect here in the room, it's always important that we are a dynamic and living project, and that we are not going to deliver in 2022 the solutions to problems of 2016. We will have to deliver things that are still relevant in 2022, and I guess the Union will look very differently in that year compared to 2016. So the economic and fiscal governance case study. We know that there has been an incredible flurry of EU measures, legislative, executive measures, because of all kinds of problems, let's say, of political consensus, we have complicated arrangements. Quite a few of those arrangements are rather intergovernmental than supranational in nature. And so we really have to see there, for instance, if you look at the Fiscal Compact Treaty, what are the issues there? Potential lack of democratic oversight, role of parliaments, the European Parliament, national parliament, rule of law constraints. And what are the implications of such arrangements? What are the consequences also of such intergovernmental mechanisms for solidarity and justice? I make a little footnote here as a lawyer. I know that it once upon a time at least was the hope and ambition of the Commission to be able to integrate all these intergovernmental arrangements into the treaties in the long run. And that's probably also why they wrote into the call for the Horizon 2020 project that in the end, among our policy recommendations, we will also be asked to make a number of treaty revision recommendations. We'll see what we do in that respect. Again, that we will see in 2022. Counterterrorism policies. Here we, of course, enter already the complexity of the division of competences to the extent that it was not already the case in economic and fiscal governance, of course. Because where do you put counterterrorism? As a policy field of the European Union, you can link it to many issues. You can link it to, say, the area of freedom, security, and justice, as we used to call that beautiful term in the EU, in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. You can link it partly to CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, and so on. One thing is clear, this is not exclusive domain of the European Union, and we also know that member states are very jealously guarding their national and, say, sovereignty concerns with regard to the fight against against terrorism. There is also, of course, this delicate balancing act that is so essential to counterterrorism, namely, on the one hand, being able to enhance security of citizens to protect democracy and the rule of law, but also safeguarding human rights, which is, as we all know, especially since 9/11, one of the, say, evergreens in the whole theme of the fight against terrorism. There, as I said, because of the complexity of the field, we also essentially have to analyze what the EU institutions are doing, but also what the implications are for the cooperation between the institutions, between the agencies, the European Court of Justice, a number of justice and home affairs agencies, but also in the relationship with the member states, of course. Then there is trade. You would wonder, why should we address the trade policies of the European Union? Because this is the area of exclusive competence per se. Well, in 2016, we had already a prefiguration in a certain way of contestation in this regard. You will remember the CETA debates. We had TTIP debates. We had the CETA because TTIP did not come about. Everybody was jumping on CETA as a kind of substitute for the TTIP debates. And alone in my own country, Belgium, suddenly the Walloon Parliament became world famous because they objected, they vetoed the signature, not even the ratification, the signature of the CETA agreement. You had the somewhat hallucinating situation that the Canadian Minister of Trade and Foreign Affairs had to descend from Brussels to Namur to have a talk with the Walloon Parliament. And I remember vividly the press conference of President Juncker of the Commission, who, of course, as a former Luxembourg Prime Minister, knows very well the complexities of the Belgian federal system, and he basically told at the press conference, "Permettez-moi d'expliquer le système fédéral belge aux Belges." So he basically said, I will explain to the Belgians what went wrong in their federal system. But I mean, it's quite interesting to see how one subnational parliament at a certain moment took the whole European Union and Canada hostage in a debate about basically the democratic legitimacy and accountability of these deep and comprehensive new generation of trade agreements such as the CETA. And I think that is indeed what this issue is about. Even trade is now controversial, deeply controversial. We have all kinds of politicization issues. We know also that citizens are very worried by not just the rules that are written down, the whole context of the negotiation, lack of transparency, business interests, and so on, but also, of course, the whole dispute settlement system. Remember the whole discussion about ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlement system, which now you can link to the European Commission's noble, but maybe hard to reach proposals for a so-called permanent world investment court. Migration policy. Migration policy, I don't need to say that here in Italy, is politically very controversial. And in fact, it's everywhere controversial in the globe. I just come back from teaching a course in Ottawa in Canada, and they are also in the run-up to elections. And there too, migration is now controversial. So everywhere it is a controversy. But especially in the EU context, we are again confronted with the issue of shared competences. And you are confronted, especially since the 2015, say, events, with a resurgent nationalist, somewhat populist discourse that potentially undermines also the solidarity, the belief in EU legitimacy in the area of migration. Again, the idea of walls, fences versus bridges is very much alive here. So here too, we need to make in our project an analysis of trade-offs between, on the one hand, EU and national coordination, but also democratic legitimacy and rule of law mechanisms, especially, I think, in the perspective of solidarity, make solidarity work in the European Union. I come to the end of my presentation. I hope I have made clear what we want to do as part of our 4-year project. You see it really ambitious, and we really hope that we can address some fundamental issues in the project. Today, we're also ambitious in a way. We have to address a number of very important fundamental questions here. How do we make sense of the complexity of the current authority arrangements between the European Union and its member states? Both what I would say in the vertical and the horizontal dimensions. Vertical, the member states versus the institutions, it remains a very difficult issue. I mean, especially in the 4 case study areas that I've mentioned, but far beyond that, it's an always ongoing problematic. Horizontal dimensions, yeah, between the institutions, we are living in a system that is complex, but that is based upon some kind of institutional balance, to quote the case law of the European Court of Justice. How is this institutional balance unfolding, developing, and to what extent in this institutional balance do we need, with our project, to think about extra reinforcements of both the democratic and the rule of law dimension. But among our discussions today, I really would be grateful if we could also have a bit of a kind of, take a back seat and look a little bit in a broader perspective to ask ourselves the question, what, in the first place, has caused the current erosion of the legitimacy of Europe's institutions? And how can citizens be placed at the center of a new legitimacy narrative? So that's what I hope really also to, sorry, I'm a bit too early, what I hope to be the outcomes of the workshop, that in the end, and not just at the end of today, but also in the so-called deliverables that we are expected to produce for the European Commission, that we're going to clarify and reflect on notions of legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty, the conditions under which democracy and rule of law, as understood in our European Union setting, can lead to a stronger legitimacy and authority for the Union, but also what the European institutions should deliver and how they should be held accountable for what they should deliver. And then last but not least, hopefully by the end of today, we will also have a bit of a clearer idea how to pave the way towards reconnecting EU institutions with citizens. I think, a good speech always is, I think, in need of a good quote. And let me just end with this quote. It's part of the inspirational speech that Simone Veil gave when the European Parliament, back in 1979, remember, had its first direct elections and first convened and chose Simone Veil as its president, and where she said the following things: let us not be deluded into believing that the strictly institutional limitations on its powers can prevent a parliament such as ours from speaking out at all times and in every field of community action with the political authority conferred upon it by its election. End of quote. This is, of course, specifically in the context of the European Parliament. We should not generalize this to necessarily all other institutions, but you will see what I like about the quote, that is that indeed it contrasts again these issues such as powers, but on the other hand, political authority. And I think it's very inspirational, looking back especially at 1979, when the European Parliament, didn't have really such an important legislative role. If you compare that today with the current European Parliament post-Lisbon, it's a night and day difference. But the thing is still the same. It's about basically the contrast between powers and then the political authority and how this can generate its own forms of legitimacy. Thank you very much. You see now I have to change hats from, say, speaking to chairing this next session, and we're really delighted to introduce our very distinguished keynote speaker for this morning, President and Professor Giuliano Amato from the Italian Constitutional Court. There is too much to be said, and I will do injustice to his incredibly impressive curriculum. Let me just highlight that Professor Amato is Professor Emeritus at the European University Institute in Florence, Member of Parliament for 18 years, that he has had various high office executive functions, twice Treasury Minister, Minister of Interior, twice Prime Minister of Italy, that we also know him in some of his other international and European roles. He has headed the International Commission on the Balkans, but very importantly also for our discussions today, he has been Vice President of the Convention on the Future of Europe. And as I just said, he has also in September 2013 been appointed as a judge of the Constitutional Court by the President of the Republic. So, President, Professore, we have very high expectations. We're looking forward to your keynote. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not too high expectations, because it's not at all easy, even mostly nowadays, because of the complexity of the... Does it work?
No, not really.
That's great. Does it work now? Yes. Yeah. Because of the complexity, as you said, which is always complex in any multi-level system of governance, but even more here with the tradition of our nation states that makes solidarity something very difficult to achieve. We all know that the main quotation here is the Schuman Declaration of 9 May 1950, when he clearly had in mind that building up an integrated European system implied the growing of solidarity among our member states and our peoples, which was necessarily going to be a process in time. There had been a war. There had been 2 wars in the 20th century. Conflicts between European states that had only in weapons their solutions necessarily feelings against one another. So, this is basically our problem, and somehow it has remained such. Probably this is the reason why, I don't know whether you remember a book of 15, 18 years ago by Philipp Schmitter on democratizing Europe, and I'm sure I will never agree with him in his conception of the European Union as a consortium or a condominium, he said, and therefore excluding any form of state, even of a federal state, he said. No, this is a little bit too much for me. And perhaps one of the reasons why we are facing the difficulties of today is that too much of a condominium has entered in the system of governance of our European Union, yet the supporters of an integrated Europe too frequently forget the fundamental truth upon which Schmitter based his argument, the tension between diversities and uniformity that exists when you want to integrate not citizens or local communities, but nation states. Many of us, perhaps, emotionally, tend to think, as Victor Hugo did and said in the Peace Congress held in Paris in 1849, a day will come when you France, you Russia, you Italy, you England, you Germany, all of you nations of the continent, will closely merge into a superior unity, the same way as Bretagne, Normandy, Bourgogne, Alsace, and Lorraine have merged into France. No, it's not so simple. And it's not simple also merging regions, because there are regional differences that might play a heavy role. I don't know whether Belgium is a case of regions, very special regions anyhow, but it's there, as he said. But here it's even more difficult, a union of states. And as I said, mostly a union of the European states with their history. Don't forget that a historian like Lucien Febvre, who was in favor of Europe, but very much aware of what we are, said, be careful, because behind states we have nations, and nations are ready to kill Europe. So, somebody has written that we succeeded in moving up the process of integration only because an emotionally irresistible motivation, such as no more wars among us, in generations that had lived the war, generations where my father, my brother, my family was killed due to the war. This kind of motivation, never again, was needed for us, not to build immediately an integrated state, but to move on and start off with the process of integration. And somebody said since the beginning, what will happen when this motivation won't be with us anymore? With future generations, that will have words in their past memory, but not emotionally involving their feelings and their own identity. So we speak of multi-layer systems of governance. I remember a beautiful small lecture given in this room by Charles Mayer. Some of you might remember, the historian from Harvard, who spoke to us of the difficulties of nested democracies. And the notion of nested is exactly the same. You can't apply to nested democracies the rules, the principles, not even the expectations that you have in systems where, I repeat, only citizens of a traditional nation have to be gathered together. If you think of the European Union as it is now, of the peaking of national feelings we are coping with now, you have to appreciate the efforts that were made in the first decades of our union, when the common identity was built up. Historically, there had always been a European identity, but it was a cultural identity only. We had a common culture. Most of us shared civil law, some of us common law, but the principles of Roman law were behind almost everything. Patterns of life were similar in most of our countries. Professors wandering from a university to another had somehow spread around the same notion of legal rights, of natural law, of human rights, of the rule of law, even though there has always been an enormous difference between our Rechtsstaat and the common law rule of law. But anyhow, after a while, some basic principles such as division of power, its limits to the abuses of power, etc., became a common asset of all the European states. But it was just a cultural matter. Due to the European community, this became something more substantial. The common constitutional traditions of the member states, due to the European Court of Justice, became the legal source of legal rights of all the European citizens. And after the European Court of Justice had established this new set of rights, also the treaties adopted the same language, the same formulation, substantially accepted to transfer into the acquis of the treaties themselves the common constitutional traditions. And the process of harmonization was enormous, even higher, and this might be a problem, I will go back on this, even higher than in some federal states. But we had to be aware, and we still have to be aware, that a functioning balance has always to be found between common identity and national identities, between powers to be exercised at the supranational level and powers remaining at the national level. Finding instruments of representations and accountability, and this is perhaps the bulk of the difficulty, that satisfy both the common and the national identities. The example that I have lived with for years is the European referendum. I remember that when we were working in the convention, one of the demands of a group of young people, students from several European member states, came up to visit us and said, well, if you want to do something for the Europe of the future, let us set the rules for the European referendum. Their naive belief was that a European referendum with a European majority was the bulk of a European democracy. The objections immediately submerged the idea that has remained there. You want to tell me, Irish, that it is democratic for Europe, a system where I will be outnumbered by German voters? Well, but you are a European citizen. So as European citizens, you Irish and you German are on the same footing. Not at all. I'm Irish, and my Irish identity, I'm using the Irish case, but I could use any, also Belgian case, the Italian, as usual in the middle. And so we could manage anyway. But, I mean, there are small national communities and big national communities. So, at that point, what is democratic? A system in which the vote of each European citizen has the same weight of any other vote, or a system in which there is some sort of balance, somehow correcting the generalized voting with something that avoids small national communities to be outnumbered by the big ones. So, we are still dealing with that kind of problem. In conditions nowadays in which, for several reasons that he has already illustrated, mostly the effects of this crisis, one after the others, created tensions among our national communities. And therefore, I feel hostility frequently for my fellow European citizens more than solidarity. This is what is happening nowadays. But in general terms, if we consider the problem in its abstract terms, we have to admit, if you ask yourselves why aren't the Europeans satisfied with Europe, you find two opposite reasons. On the one side, it is perceived, the European Union, as not sufficiently aware of our national diversities and of our needs. And on the other side, because it gives too much to national actors and too many of its decision-making processes, due to this intergovernmentalism that has been spreading in these years, the citizens do not perceive the European Union as a meaningful part of their own government. They perceive their governments. I will go back to this immediately. So, if you try to transfer this general assessment into what is needed for more legitimacy, what is needed for more authority, I will tell you that for the sake of legitimacy, perhaps more flexibility and more mutual recognition would be very healthy, more than what we have done up to now in the past. You are aware of the working methods of the Court of Strasbourg. The Court of Strasbourg has a very difficult job because working with 27, 28 member states of the European Union is a simple matter compared to working with the more than 40 very different member states of the Council of Europe. And therefore, they use this notion of margin of appreciation that allows them to reach concluding assessments of violation or not violation of their charter, also depending on the consensus that exists among the member states on every single issue. Of course, there is a moment when they have to take their decision. Also, if still there is a group of states that supports the opposite solution. How courts decide that the moment has arrived for them to decide is a very difficult question. I asked Nino Scalia, how did it happen in 2015 that they decided that same-sex marriage was covered by the Equal Protection Clause and was therefore a federal right and not something under the jurisdiction of the member states. Of course, he would not have done it, he personally. But certainly, in a complex, multi-level system of government, on several matters, the margin of appreciation of the member states should be preserved. It is undeniable that for the sake of market integration, we have harmonized our national legislations up to a level that does not exist in federal states. And you know it, because if you have a car accident in Massachusetts, the form you have to fill is different from the form that you find in South Dakota or in New York State. In Europe, happily for us, the form is the same, because harmonization has meant for us also giving this kind of uniformity. I frequently quote John McCormick, a political scientist of some years ago, a great Scottish scholar, who said, you know, you wanted, for the protection of animals, a directive due to which, if the wind is above a certain speed, animals cannot be transported by truck. Now, on the basis of your directive, no animal can be transported in Scotland, never, because our wind is always above the speed of the directive. Wouldn't it be better for you to have a bracket and to leave the member states free to choose their speed and their wind? This was just an example, because the problem goes beyond the speed of the wind and the transport of animals. Now, throughout the years, this has been a powerful factor of confronting the Union as something intrusive, denying my specificities. Well, the Italians well know that a friend of several of us, Minister of Finance for years, Giulio Tremonti, has always used this argument, and not he only, against the European Union. A very powerful argument, a very powerful argument. We discovered, as you know, mutual recognition, which is usefully applied in several areas, but probably not enough. The bulk of our common economic and fiscal policy is a figure that was German, 60%. 60% financially made sense for Germany. Now, after a while, all of us can say, well, it's 60, and we accept 60. But if things become difficult, it is heavy for some of our member states to accept 60 as a benchmark. And somebody going back to the day when the decision was made that it had to be 60, somebody will resent the 60 and will say, this is not something that has to do with our common needs, this is Germany. It has happened. So, I stop it here on this point because I could give other examples, but don't be surprised if somebody argues that in order to build a wider supranational community, you not only need unified powers, but you also need flexibility, mutual recognition, and space for national identities to be recognized and to be satisfied. For the sake of authority, perhaps the opposite is needed. Decisions should depend less from the daily agreements of the member states. Otherwise, the only authority that will be visible will be the authority of the member states. And this is what is happening now. Let me be very candid. I don't think that the distance from the citizens of the European institutions depend on the lack of direct contacts or from the obscurity of their language. This is daily rhetoric of the anti-Europeans, but it is a very tricky argument not to be taken seriously. The context exists, and the language is not spatially obscure. I like quoting documents of the European Commission that are much clearer than documents of any of our national governments. I can quote directives of the European Union, the language of which is much more understandable than the language of our national legislative acts. So, the distance exists, but it depends on the context of the decisions, not sufficiently relevant to the lives of the citizens, or on the paramount role of the member states in taking the decisions. The former case, decisions not sufficiently relevant. Let us be honest, it's the case of the European Parliament. It's directly elected. What do you want more? It was an advisory body several years ago, and it has conquered year after year, treaty after treaty, a substantial part of the legislative power of the Union. But the areas upon which this legislative power is exercised are areas that are perceived by the citizens as the areas of a regulatory agency. Therefore, the European Parliament is a bizarre European regulatory agency with a wide membership, much wider than needed, after all. Give the European Parliament the taxing power and the power to regulate the tax obligations of the citizens depending on policies that you are pursuing. You will have an attention to the European Parliament much higher. So, do you want to know why the European Parliament is less important to us than our national parliaments? Because no national parliament is without taxing power. The only parliament in the world without taxing power is the European one. Does it mean something for you then? Wouldn't you think that this is relevant? Quite a lot. So, the lack of contact, the distance, does not depend on the miles between Bergamo and Brussels, because also Congress is very far away from Washington, Washington State, California, South Dakota. It's not that. It's not a matter of miles. It's a matter of powers. It's a matter of decisions that have an impact on my life. And when did the American citizens care about the Federal Congress? When the Commerce Clause became the legal basis for regulations affecting all of the aspects of the economic and commercial life of the American citizens. Before the end of the 19th century, member states' assemblies were much more important, and Congress was distant, exactly as our European Parliament. These things have to be said because mostly in this time of debates dominated by rhetoric of several kinds, you have to have a clear understanding of the relevant arguments and of the rest. This is the first point. The second point is who is deciding. what is important. And here you have the other side, the other institutions of the European Union that apparently are European, but substantially they are national. Look at the difference between economic and fiscal policies. ECOFIN and the European Central Bank. Well, ECOFIN is a condominium, exactly as Philippe had in mind. It's a condominium. And we have our national ministers representing their national interests, finding, if they do find it, a balance among their different interests. And of course, what can they do? Set rules. There is a dispute in Europe, government by rules, government by discretionary power. It has a sort of background because of the preference of Germany for the rules and the preference of France for discretionary power. Okay, I'm aware of it. But the substance is that if an European institution gets a power is exercised as such with some discretion. If there is no power, there are only rules. Because nobody has power over the others. And therefore, they together can only set common rules, and all of them are supposed to comply with the rules. This is how fiscal policies run, and the rules not necessarily are complied with. How different the European Central Bank would be should it be a condominium like ECOFIN, and it could be. After all, the Council of the Bank is formed by the governor of national banks. They could set rules, and each of them would go back home applying or not applying these rules. And the ensemble of these things would be the European monetary policy. None of them could say one day, whatever it takes. Stopping the markets. None of them could decide quantitative easing. Let's do it. I do it, and I divide the things among the all of you. But I do divide the things among the all of you. So on the one side, power. And it is recognized. The European Central Bank is a European power. It does have authority. And here the differences between legal scholars and political scientists doesn't play any role. Whatever their notion of authority, they have to recognize that there is some authority here, and there is no authority in ECOFIN. So, if for the sake of legitimacy, in a nested democracy, Charles Mayer would say, some more recognition of diversities is needed for the sake of authority, some more integrated power is needed, and we should abandon intergovernmentalism in areas where it has been damaging. So, somebody might find it disappointing that in order to vitalize our union in terms of democracy, I haven't even mentioned the toolbox of elections and of participatory democracy. if you want to connect people, you think of elections, of participatory democracy. I rely more on the distribution of powers and competencies. Because there are things that we give for granted in nation states, but are not granted at all in a multi-layered system of government. Can you imagine our nation states? I speak to the Italians. Italy, on top of our system of government, the Conference of the Regions. Now, you might object to the efficiency of several national governments we have had in our history, but my God, the Conference of the Regions would be a little bit words, or not. And here we are. In some areas, we have European institutions. In others, we have the Conference of the Nation States. We have the Condominium. Having said so, I don't dismiss reforms in apicibus. Should it be accepted, I would support the transfer not of all the candidates to the European Parliament, but of some of them from national constituencies to wider constituencies, not necessarily European-wide, but of member states in the, let's say, logic of the recent quite disappointing new treaty between France and Germany, quite disappointing for them, because high expectation, much ado for almost nothing. But anyhow, in the logic of that agreement, there could be common candidates in a wider French and German constituency. If Italy continues like today, I don't know which other member states could join it for a common constituency anyhow. Not even Malta, because we are quarreling daily with Malta. God. I would be much less enthusiastic of the popular election of a president of the Union, because it's beyond what our national differences allow us to do. The very simple problem of language, of this guy going around through 27 states and send him to Hungary campaigning. The distance here is very high between their language and the language that the other speaks and understand. So, now, my suggestions could be easily criticized as an untenable paradox. The citizens want public powers closer to them, and you propose more powers to the further level of our governance. I repeat, I'm not at all sure that our citizens want closer public powers. They want public power sufficient in responding to their demands. And we should be aware that there are demands that go to the European Union, and that the current system of governments does not allow the Union to satisfy. It's interesting. Take the case of Italy. Now, the definition that the current political majority gives of itself is more sovereignty. We are sovereignists. We want national identity to be preserved. We want Europe to take care of immigration. So they don't want less Europe. They want more Europe. for their most important stake, their demand is for more European powers. And actually, since they have accepted the rules of the game, of the budgetary game, eventually, they have accepted it, what they really miss is what we have been asking for years at the European level, a stabilization functions funded in the European budget for interventions, financial interventions from above, keeping the economies of the member states under the restraints of financial readjustments alive. So here too, you have more Europe that is needed. If these are the arguments, somebody has to use them. Finding the courage to speak to citizens who are still considered interlocutors in a rational kind of discourse. This goes to the fact that nowadays somebody argues, don't even try, because people react emotionally. They don't react rationally. This is stupid. It is not necessarily so. Human beings have remained with their intellectual qualities despite whatever is happening. And only coward political leaders can accept the fact that they have to speak to the belly, as we say in Italian, and not to the minds. This is not necessarily so, and therefore, this is my conclusion, assuming that a rational discourse is still possible, let us nurture this discourse with good stuff. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for this very stimulating, brilliant, and enlightening speech. Extremely rich, and I couldn't imagine a more ideal speech to feed into the discussions we are going to have in our workshop today. We are a little bit behind schedule, but we also started a little bit late. The coffee is in any event in the room, so it will not go away. So I would suggest that we make, we use the unique opportunity of being able to maybe ask a few questions to our keynote speaker here. Who would like to do that? I see Professor Follesdal actually about raising his hand, and now I'm forcing him to raise his hand.
Why, come here and take the microphone, because from the back of the room they can't hear you.
Well, I think we're all honored to have you present your thoughts in this lucid way, incorporating both legal and political science perspectives in this. So among the many, many issues that it would be interesting to hear you more about is, one of the areas of concern here is, you mentioned some of the practices of the European Court of Human Rights, and it would be very interesting to hear your perspective. Do you think some of those mechanisms, the margin of appreciation doctrine or the role of a consensus, may be developed also by the Court of Justice of the European Union with modifications? And in particular, again, for our purposes, some of us, including myself, seem to see a pattern in the European Court of Human Rights that the margin of appreciation is something that a state may be awarded only if the court sees evidence of a good faith domestic proportionality test, that human rights have been taken seriously within the domestic democratic system. So in that way, nudging more.
Nudging more than, yeah.
And then a second question, if I may, would there's also, as many here know, an interesting, shall we say, dialogue between these two courts, whether it would be a good thing for the European Union to be subject to the Convention on Human Rights and the Court of Human Rights. Some of us outsiders, as philosophers, are partly struggling to see, so what is at stake except the claims to authority and who has the final word on interpretation? And again, your reflections on, would it be a value added, and if so, what would it be, or would it basically be threatening something worth keeping? Thank you.
Thank you. Just for the information of our keynote speaker, this is the last keynote speaker of today. So it's in a way, he's asking for some inspiration for his final keynote.
That's good. Some other questions before I answer, or?
Dimitri, why don't you start talking? We're coming.
No, wait a second.
I particularly enjoyed the part on the distance between the citizens and the union. But I would like you to consider another idea of how to measure that distance probably, and that's the moral choices underlying the division of competences between Europe and the nation states. And it feeds into what you said about the speed of transporting animals, etc. When you explain to an American citizen that the federal government has regulated the speed, very often there will be references to some fundamental rights considerations, what the governments cannot do, why the states are prohibited from regulating, for instance, free speech. In Europe, these moral considerations are sometimes replaced with internal market rationale. So when you start talking to the citizens, explaining to them that they cannot drive the animals at a particular speed, the ultimate justification is not the moral choice behind our democracy, but the coherence of trading between us. And this might undermine our perception of the difference by enlarging it to a huge extent. So I'm very curious what your reaction to this possibly objection would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking around, shall we start with these two questions?
Shall we start with, yeah, we can. Well, I'm very much in favor of nudging more than ordering. And of course, the margin of appreciation as a sort of continuous game where both of us are involved is something that allows transformation in member states that might be more easily accepted if they arrive in time and not necessarily immediately. Let's say the Court of Strasbourg has been very attent and clever in the area I was quoting Nino Scalia, in the area of homosex relations, because initially it was entirely left to the appreciation of the member states. Then in the Greek case in 2015, when there was a complaint coming from Greece where a civil unions statute was enacted, not including homosexual, the court said, you are not obliged to adopt a civil unions regulation, but if you do, you can't leave the homosexuals out of it. The following year, due to a complaint coming from an Italian, I don't remember the case, the court said a civil union legislation is needed in order to protect the rights of homosexuals. So little by little, the rights of homosexuals become the main benchmark of national legislations, but there had been a lot of time for member states to go into it. This is something that the European Court of Justice does much less, I must say, and in the recent Taricco case brought to the European Court of Justice by the Italian Constitutional Court, somehow we forced the European Court of Justice to take our national identity more into consideration. Of course, this happens depending on the actual relationship between courts. If there is propensity to dialogue, it works. But there is this propensity now. And really, it has been extremely important for the European life that the Bundesverfassungsgericht accepted the preliminary ruling procedure in order to regulate a conflict between national identity and common rules. As you well know, our national legal systems include the power to erect counter limits, as we say. If a European principle or a European decision injures an essential feature of our national system, we can oppose a counter limit. This decision does not enter. And Article 4 of the Lisbon Treaty is being used now as the legal basis for the counter limits to be erected. This route is a ruinous route, in my view, because it creates a distance. If I have a doubt, if I transform my national principle into the reason for a doubt, and I expose the doubt to the European Court of Justice and offer the Court of Justice room for recognition of these differences, my principle of more mutual recognition will be applied and will work. I wonder how much of this can be done in dealing with Poland and Hungary, because there is a limit beyond which you can't go in accepting Article 4 national identity features. No national identity feature can be recognized as when it is openly against our common principles. And this is the case, certainly, of the statute of Poland that is now under the attention of the Constitution of the European Court of Justice. Now, the question mark here refers to Poland. When eventually the final decision will be taken, will they comply with it? Shouldn't they do it? We would have quite a problem. We would have quite a problem. I don't know how it can be solved. Oh, the point of, that kind of difference is not necessarily, it is a difference between us and the Americans. The Americans, whatever they do, also if immoral, they give it a moral foundation because it's part of their culture, actually, and it's part of that mixture between ethical and religious principles and legal principles. We are very different from this angle. We are more secular in our underpinnings, I would say. But you are right when you say that this is a historical and legal fact, undeniable. We have built much more than the market upon the principles of the market. That's it. Because we had that kind of password for the sake of the market, for the sake of the integration. We have done several things that are not necessarily so closely connected to the market, but the legal basis was, at my time, Article 99, Article 100 of the treaties before Lisbon. And this has somehow reduced the impact of the motivation and has brought also to opinions about us that we don't deserve. It's only a market, they only care, which was not so in several cases. It is a fact that several individual rights were discovered by the European Court of Justice on the basis of the treaty clauses having to do with the market. So it would be much helpful for the future to disconnect, but it may happen now, because now we have the Charter. And the Charter is very important. If you think of the importance nowadays of the cases having to do with data protection, portability of data, sovereignty of the citizen and of the states on data, now we have Article 8 of the Charter of the European rights. Years ago, quite likely, it would have gone onto the market clauses. This makes a difference.
Wonderful. I mean, we should deepen this conversation if we had more time, because, of course, when we read Article 6, paragraph 1 of the TEU, it really stresses that the Charter does not give any additional competences to the Union. So
No.
we continue to sit in a very asymmetrical situation. It's a bit of a kind of, false perspective. With the Lisbon Treaty, we have this kind of perspective that the Union has become a political union founded on fundamental values, Article 2. But in essence, the core of the powers of the EU remain economic. And that's why always this discourse on the internal market comes back, even though we have a charter, but the same treaty says that the charter doesn't grant any additional competences to the European Union.
But at the same time, on the basis of the Charter, the Union has adopted Article 8, a regulation, the Data Protection General Regulation, DPGR, and the regulation is binding for the member states for other reasons. And therefore, somehow you widen the area that is linked to an article of the Charter producing an act that is binding for the states. So I was sure that this would happen. It is not adding any new competence, but it may be used to widen if you want to do it.
Wonderful. It's a great story also about incrementalism and so also what you say about the case law of the courts. Daniela, you wanted to say?
Yeah. Well, let me just go back to this idea of more Europe. I enormously appreciated this, idea that you shared with us, that we need to go beyond the current narrative that is to destroy Europe and to say no, less Europe, citizens do not want Europe, and so on and so forth. But definitely there are sectors or areas or policy problems on which citizens would be maybe ready to demand more Europe, or politicians may be ready to demand more Europe. But I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure that we do differ in the different member states. If we go to ask in which sector we want more Europe, we would not agree, at least not ex ante. We need a process. So
I mean, you're right, but again, here you have to be sufficiently flexible to mix up the more and the less. That I tried to keep separate, but there are cases in which you have to make the exercise of putting together more and less. The case of immigration, in my view, is one of them. This is something that perhaps I wouldn't say where I still be in politics, but Hungary is a member of the Union. A general European regulation, whatever it is, of immigration, in my view, should never try to oblige Hungary, as any other member state, to receive mandatorily a certain amount of immigrants. As a member of the European Union, Hungary should be obliged, as all the other member states, to contribute financially to whatever is needed for receiving, integrating, assisting immigrants in the full respect of their rights, but not necessarily because this is something that is against what they are ready to do, and you create an unavoidable rupture that you should avoid. So, receiving immigrants should be something for a coalition of the willings, because most of all, their labor markets offer jobs to them. We know that this is the unsaid of the current hypocrisy of the European Union and its states. They receive thousands and thousands of immigrants needed in their labor market, but they refuse to openly negotiate with the countries of origins legal inflows of migrants due to the needs of their labor markets. I expect sooner or later these countries to reopen this essential channel. I don't expect Hungary to do it. Mm-hmm. And take the case of Poland. Should we conclude that most of us are in favor, and I can't see why we shouldn't, of homosexual relations or whatever, give time to Poland to enter the 21st century, to go out of Radio Maria and enter into they need time. Ireland has changed in time. Don't force Poland tomorrow to be what Poland tomorrow can't be.
Well, Mr. President, Professor Amato, it was a great honor to have you with us, and I would just wish that your wisdom was shared with the current generation of politicians, because I think you have been saying us a great number of very true and very wise messages. It has been an extreme honor for us to receive you here in our workshop. It's going to really feed into our discussions and into the output of the Reconnect project. I'm very much convinced of it, and we are deeply grateful to you too. Thank you very much. And we will now have a coffee break, and because we have impinged so far on our fundamental right to a coffee break, I would, if the other colleagues would agree with that, I would suggest that we reconvene at 11:15. No objections? Then we do that. Thank you very much again. this task, but I'll do my best at least. We have several time constraints, also because we have to be, we have to finish by 1 o'clock, because we have limited time for the lunch. And so I already apologize with the speakers, but we have 15 minutes each, and I will take the authority to call you to your responsibilities. Just one word on this panel. Let me highlight that we are discussing revisiting the notion of authority in the morning and then legitimacy in the afternoon. And using the definition that Professor Wouters told us in the morning is probably a wise choice. He defined authority as delegated competence to exercise power. And in this panel, that coherently with the Reconnect Project and its aim is interdisciplinary. We have constitutional theorists, EU lawyers, administrative lawyers, political scientists. We will discuss the idea of delegation and the condition for exercise of power. So it was a wise choice to discuss it before going into legitimacy, and so the moral justification for that exercise. But I don't want to take up any more seconds, and I will open the floor to Professor Corkin, who is senior lecturer in Middlesex University of London and one of the partners of Reconnect. Please, Joseph, you have the floor for the said 15 minutes. And
Thank you very much. Okay. As a Brit coming over to Italy and in the middle of the madness, I felt, having given the title I wanted to talk about, that I could scarcely arrive here and not mention Brexit. But the picture that you've got there, that's Charles I. Now, I see parallels here, and I'm not the only one to see parallels here, between the constitutional crisis that we're going through at the moment in the UK and maybe the last constitutional crisis that was of the same magnitude in the British system, which was our civil war. And what I want to do is address the issues of the Reconnect Project, which I see positioned in this problematic of Europe, whereby we're facing citizens who feel disconnected from their elites. We have populist movements, we have sort of democratic demagoguery, we have what I prefer to call it simply illiberal nationalism. Illiberal nationalism because it's a movement that is ranged against the liberal internationalist project, the liberal order. And it's not necessarily explicitly anti-democratic. It's often it's very much this resurgence of a sort of a hyper-democracy, and it's our leaders or these movements seeking to channel directly the power of the people through themselves against this liberal order, against this liberal internationalist order. And that's my route into talking about the last constitutional crisis and how the UK might resolve it and what connections there are to supranationalism, to the idea of Europe and the state. Now, we're a very disparate group, both on this panel and in the room and in the project as a whole, of academics and our disciplines. And we all come with our different disciplinary tools. And I'm a constitutional theorist, and so I look at this crisis, this problem, whatever we want to call it, and I have a limited range of tools with which to solve it. And as someone wiser than me once said, when you confront a problem as a hand worker and your only tool is a hammer, you try and solve every tool with a hammer. And all I can apologize for doing is trying to solve this problem with my hammer. And my hammer is these base foundational constitutional concepts, the ideas of democracy, the ideas of what rule of law means, what authority is, what sovereignty is, these foundational ideas of the Constitution and how they speak to the crises of today. So, we go back to the English Civil War. Now, that is, as I said, Charles I. He lost his head in 1649, and his was a challenge to the authority of Parliament, which led then to the Civil War. So in fact, the defining event really of the Civil War was him entering Parliament. He entered Parliament and sat in the Speaker's chair. This was in 1642. And he claimed the right to rule. The right to rule not through Parliament. He claimed, like the democratic demagogues of today, the people, or for him, he'd been given the divine right, effectively, to rule the people. Nowadays, our populist leaders talk about the will of the people. And damn these elite institutions and that get in my way. These structures that are aiming to check and balance powers and to constrain what I do. I speak with the authority of the people. Now, he met in Parliament. You'll see on the left-hand side a speaker that's William. I have to look it up. William Lenthal. And William Lenthal refused on sort of behalf of the rebellious Parliament to recognize the authority of the king in this way. And we have now that role reprised. I believe in Europe now, John Bercow, who is the current speaker on the very right-hand side, you see him negotiating there with some of the government figures, who is actually, some of you here in Europe, we have to speak now of the UK and Europe almost as if we are going through this divorce, but of leading this almost parliamentarian rebellion against the government. The government now replacing the crown. So the battle between, the crown in our constitutional structure governs through Her Majesty's government. You have, so our executive governs through Her Majesty's government. In those days, back in 1642, it was directly this contrast between the crown, the power of the crown, and the power of Parliament. And they wrestle now for control. Because government seems to have lost control of this constitutional crisis of how do we extricate ourselves from a union that we've been a member of for 4.5 decades, with which our constitutional structure is so intimately bound up. At this point, we need to introduce two huge changes that have taken place since then: democracy and globalization. Democracy, the government, unlike the King Charles, can speak with the authority or the claim or the delegated authority of the people. And so the contestability in that power play between Parliament and government is of a different dynamic. But as I said, there's a similarity there, because in that contestability, there is this implicit claim from the government to be channeling the will of the people, the referendum. The people spoke, and the government needs to do the will of the people, and damn the parliamentarians that stand in their way. But we also have globalization having taken place. It's been a process, and it's an ongoing process, and this is this growing interdependence within the world, to which these ideas of sovereignty, of parliament of contesting with the government who has sovereignty, in some ways has to be set in that context. that to declare legal independence, this notion of sovereignty as legal independence, cannot work fully in a world that is factually interdependent. And what I want to do is to talk a little bit about what supranationalism means as a way of managing that legal independence in a factually interdependent world. So we've got Parliament wrestling with government for control of the national destiny. We've got populists or the government, in the case of the UK, channeling the will of the power in an absolutist sense in the way that the king did. And I want to return to the constitutional fundamentals as a way of trying to understand this and the connection to the European Union. The first thing, the first fundamental that I think is necessary to deal with here is this idea of constitutionalism and what constitutionalism means. And it's, as a bare minimum content, it's wrapped up with the idea of the rule of law. And it's the commitment of a political community to be governed by rules and principles that limit its sovereign body. The power has to be exercised through legally prescribed procedures. That's the basic condition of legality. And it exists actually independently of any mechanism legitimating that power. So it exists independently of democracy or the divine right to rule or anything of that nature. It also exists independently any substantive controls on that. So we can think of human rights controls on the exercise of power. But it is constraining. It requires power to be exercised through law. It denies the sovereign body the absolute power of the divine monarch. So, returning now then to the Civil War, Charles lost that battle with Parliament, and we now have picture. This was a cartoon from the London Evening Standard from a couple of days ago, and actually making a similar point to the one that I've got. You've got ranged on the left-hand side the Roundheads, today's Roundheads. They're the parliamentarians seeking to challenge the authority of the Cavaliers. They were the supporters of the king, the government, in Parliament, and contesting that authority. Parliament claimed its authority to impeach the king in 1649 on the basis that the king had been trusted with a limited power to govern by and according to the laws of the land and not otherwise. This was a claim to this idea of the sovereign body constrained by authority, by the law. And Parliament charged the king with having traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented. The king refused to enter a plea. He claimed the court had no jurisdiction over him on the basis, and I'm quoting from the king here, kings are not bound to give an account of their actions, but to God alone, the divine right to rule. In the same way that the government now makes that claim, the will of the people, and that is the absolute. The Lord President of the court, trying the king, disagreed. So we've got the king, King Charles here. This is the trial of Charles I. The king here, and over there, the Lord President of the court, Lord Bradshaw. He declared the king but an officer in trust established by history and the coronation for the protection of the people. Once broken, farewell sovereignty. And he was echoing the jurists of the contemporary jurists and jurists from before him, that the king must not be under man but under God and under law, because the law makes the king. And this is this idea of legality, that the sovereign body is something that is made by the law. Be ye ne'er so high, still the law is above thee. Again, another contemporary jurist, Thomas Fuller. If we focus, however, simply on the limiting dimension of constitutionalism, we neglect, however, how the Constitution also constitutes the body in the first place. So in that constituent moment, the constituent moment being where a constitutional state develops from or replaces an order in which power was absolute, the act that creates that first constitution without being empowered to do so, it simultaneously establishes, so confirms, or in the sense of a continuing order, the identity of the sovereign, and limits or locks down the power of the sovereign. And that's what was at stake here in the court with the Lord Bradshaw. So that's him on the left. That's Cromwell, by the way, who led the parliamentarians back then. On the right. So to put it another way, constitutionalism authorizes or constitutes and regularizes. It constrains public power. It declares which institutions exercise it, through which processes, and so renders constitutional that which would otherwise be naked power, which would be absolute and without constraint. But constitutionalism is not just about what a constitution does, it's about a mode of doing it. So a thin or neutral version speaks only to the existence of public power, not to its legitimation, and a thicker version speaks to its legitimate exercise as public power or public authority. Without legitimacy, there exists merely autocratic decree. And that's the result. So King Charles, you see there missing his head on the right-hand side. Now, every system seeks to build cultivate a belief in its legitimacy. Max Weber. The democratic claim to legitimacy builds on certain constitutional constraints. That it's exercised, that power is exercised through law, that it's constrained by law, but it's also exercised in a way that is connected, that connects that power, and the law through which it's exercised to the politics capable of legitimating it. This political enablement ushers the people into the process. Again, there's a co-originality operating here. The public authority, the sovereign body, is not just something that exists, which we then invent mechanisms to hold to account. It is established by and exists only in the presence of those mechanisms, without which there is mere public power, not public authority. Public authority is then a shared expectation among those in arrangement of asymmetric power by which those who are the objects of another's imperium, power, privileged, unilateral, discretionary authority, accept that arrangement, that imperium over them, because they accept that it is exercised through pre-established norms, the rule of law, that they can influence democracy, and that is specific to a liberal democracy within substantive constraints that uphold certain inalienable rights, human rights. Those are the pillars then of democracy. I'm being given right, okay, what I wanted to do, can I just take 1 minute? Is that allowed? Okay. What I wanted to do, because the last bit I wanted to connect to sovereignty, my claim that I wanted to move on to is this idea, this root idea of democracy requires that because of interdependence, because of a factually interdependent world and the external effects of one country upon another, that to exercise one project of democratic self-determination within one political community that has impacts on another political community that is also a parallel project of democratic self-determination requires a reconciliation of those two democratic projects. It requires management, and it's a claim, it's a democratic claim. And so what I want to do is I want to ground the idea of supranationalism in that foundational concept of democracy and the rule of law, but that would have taken another quarter of an hour, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and sorry for the warnings. And now Now the floor is for Professor Gallo, who is Professor of European Union Law here at Lewis.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I have no slides, so it will be much more boring and extremely positivistic, so I'm sorry for that. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks above all to Jan. What are the pillars and the ideals implied in the principle of Conferral as it evolved over the years? What is its rationales? What are the challenges posed by the principle? The principle, I recall, stipulates that the EU shall act only within the limits of competences conferred upon it by member states. Well, I will sketch a few answers, and then in light of such answers, we'll briefly focus on a single dimension of the principle, that is its functioning at jurisdictional level, an area where the relationship between the European Court of Justice and member states' supreme constitutional courts is very tense at the moment. Well, the Lisbon Treaty is not all about fostering European integration. The Lisbon Treaty, by locating the principle of conferral at the core of EU law, Articles 4 and 5 of the treaty, Declaration number 24 on legal personality of the EU, by listing a number of competences, by identifying the different degrees for the involvement of the EU and member states, aimed at solving a problem. The problem was the lack of legal certainty, which actually hit a different intertwined problem. In the mesh of uncertainty lie the risk for an ultra-vires activism of the EU via wide use of the principle of preemption. Think of the broad interpretation Article 114 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union on harmonization. Think of the Commission stance on Article 106 of the treaty, which triggered liberalization and privatization. In this context, with the principle of conferral, member states wanted to restore their sovereignty and made clear that they, for good, were the only masters of the treaty. It is not inherent in the EU, the idea of sovereignty. Its powers are conferred, they're not inherent. Its competence to enact legislation is identified by states and via the states foreseen in the treaty. This is the logic that inspires the principle of conferral, guides its application, and impedes any attempt to transform the EU into something somewhat similar to a federal system of integration. Well, that's what has been said so far, means that the principle is apt per se to question the process of European integration as a whole, the authority of EU law. Can such principle be rediscovered, used now and in the future by sovereignists, populists, Eurosceptics of different sort and origin, judiciaries, parliaments, governments, to keep powers for member states? Can such principle be relied on to convey the message that the EU does not have neither the authority nor the legitimacy to move forward and foster European institutionalized forms of cooperation between member states? Think of migration. Well, I'm asking those questions since the principle is being often cited nowadays by a number of anti-European parties at the European Parliament, by several national judges across Europe, by ministers and top-ranked politicians. Well, the answer to those questions is the principle can only operate if a crucial condition, if a crucial caveat is fulfilled. Article 5.2 of the Treaty on the European Union makes a connection between a link between the respect of the principle and the attainment of the objectives set out in the treaties. This means that those objectives cannot be undermined by a certain application of the principle that would cast in doubt the authority of EU law. Something very new for international organizations, something which is not new, which is in line with the uniqueness of the European Union as a special supranational organization. As written by Paul Craig, I quote, "The principle of conferral means that member states should give the EU the competence to fulfill its task." To this end, the principle of conferral engages with a number of other rules, principles, doctrines, which set a limit to its misinterpretation. So a limit to the abuse on the part of the EU in the exercise of its competences, principle of Conferral, but then there are limits to this limit. And what are these limits? What I'm referring to first, Article 352 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, Doctrine of Implied Powers. A teleological, evolving interpretation of the law prevails over a Scalian, rigid interpretation of the law. Think of the Cadi ruling, which European Court of Justice derived from a EU implicit competence to sanction natural legal persons suspected of terrorism from an explicit European objective, from an explicit competence, that is to say the fight against terrorism and the sanctioning of third countries. Second, principle of primacy of EU law. Member states cannot claim that they retain jurisdiction if the consequence will be the infringement of EU law. Member states cannot close the borders ad libitum. They cannot suspend the Schengen system as much as they like. They can do all if they comply with a procedure that is set out in the treaty, in the Schengen Borders Code regulation. And the Commission maybe should be a bit more aware of that. Third point, principle of autonomy of EU law. Member states cannot claim that they retain jurisdiction if the consequence will be the call into question of the European Court of Justice monopoly in interpretation of EU law. Member states cannot conclude among each other intra-bilateral investment treaties in which the state investor arbitral system, Jan made reference to that earlier on this morning, may overstep the European Court of Justice competence. Think of the Acmea case. Fourth, principle of loyal cooperation. Member states cannot claim that they retain jurisdiction in the field, for instance, of healthcare, social services, or vis-à-vis national champions of the economy, Telefonica, Vivendi, Telecom, because otherwise the whole market, the whole European market will be jeopardized. Fifth limit to the principle of Conferral somehow, principle of a futile effectiveness of EU law. Member states cannot claim that EU could not step in when at stake is family law. Think of the common case, very famous common case. We spoke about that with Dimitri yesterday evening, on a married gay couple willing to reside in Romania. In the judgment, the European Court of Justice, in order to ensure the enforcement of free movement of persons provisions, ruled that EU law shall take precedence over Romanian law, although in Romania, any form of gay rights, at that time still nowadays, is foreseen. Sixth point, the sixth limit to the principle of Conferral, which in turn is a limit itself. The respect of member states' national identities, which has been referred to by President Amato this morning, Article 4.2 of the treaty. Well, why is this a limit to the principle of Conferral and its misuse? Because member states cannot rely on such identity clause to hinder the application per se of EU law. In fact, national identity clause assumes that member states are acting intra vires. It is not about invoking like a sorting tool that could affirm a priori the competence of member states over the EU competence. Well, this was more or less the first part, quite prolific, maybe useless, potentially useless of my presentation. Second part, I will focus now on a single dimension, that is the relationship between the European Court of Justice and member states' supreme constitutional courts. Well, the issue is, of course, as we all know, at the center of attention in many member states. Think of Italy, Taricco saga, ruling 269, delivered by the Italian Constitutional Court, Germany, Gauweiler, Spain, Melloni, Dansk Industry in Denmark. The problem can be illustrated as it follows. In many rulings, the European Court of Justice has questioned national legislatures and Supreme Court stances on the interpretation of three pivotal EU constitutional principles: primacy, direct effect, and effectiveness. Member State Supreme Courts, in some cases reluctantly accepted, in some others rejected the ECJ approach. At the heart of this extremely dialectical rather than dialogical relationship lie the protection of fundamental rights, respect to national identity, the tenability of the democratic principle. Well, my opinion, at the center of the whole legal discourse lies ultimately the scope of the principle of Conferral. Take the example of Italy. In ruling 269, I do find a quite dangerous and unprecedented twist in the understanding by the Italian Constitutional Court of what is EU law, or what the European Court of Justice shall do, or what national jurisdiction shall do to comply with the treaties. According to Italian Constitutional Court, when fundamental rights are at stake, when the Charter comes into play, the main actor, the actor that shall act first, which means conduct, frame, steer, and channel the dialogue, is the ICC, the Italian Constitutional Court, rather than the European Court of Justice. The now very famous obiter dictum, which has been commented upon by dozens of scholars in Italy, contained in the ruling, revisit the Simmental logic, the whole logic implied in the Simmental doctrine, as it implies that national judges shall always refer to the Italian Constitutional Court for the interpretation and application of the Charter, when fundamental rights are at stake, regardless of a counter limit, regardless of the direct effect of one or more Charter provisions, meaning no disapplication, regardless of the constraints implied in the preliminary ruling procedure. And I would recall that the fourth president of the European Court of Justice, Robert Lecour, made clear that the process of European integration is strongly linked with the triangle magique constituted by the preliminary procedure, direct effect, and primacy. Well, it seems to me that the Italian Constitutional Court, in its struggle to strike a fair balance between supranationality and sovereignty, has gone a bit too far. It went far beyond the perimeter of a constitutional pluralism, albeit unwittingly, I suppose. Ruling 269, especially read along with Taricco Saga, for instance, calls into question the authority of EU law, adopting the view that constitutional courts of member states should always have the first word on the content, extent, scope, effects of fundamental rights recognized in the Charter, means preventing from the very outset the qualitative leap in rights protection at European level that is advocated, paradoxically, by those scholars who are in favor of reconcentrating fundamental rights control in the hands of national constitutional courts. What I mean is that the same scholars who claim that the European Union is always about the market are the same scholars that want to reconcentrate fundamental rights control in the hands of the Supreme Court. This is a sort of short circuit, potentially disastrous, in my opinion, for the future of the EU, and certainly a dead blow to a federalist-like developments in the EU legal system. Two concluding remarks to sum up. The first, the principle of Conferral is not an absolute principle. There are other principles which engages with the principle of Conferral, as I mentioned earlier. The EU legal order has the capacity to weaken any tools that may endanger the authority of EU law. The antibodies are principles, rules, and doctrines apt to relativize the potentially destabilizing force of the principle of Conferral. Second, concluding remark, from the standpoint of the relationship between the European Court of Justice and Member State Supreme Courts, as far as fundamental rights are concerned, I do reckon that the process of European integration and the authority of EU law are currently under attack. In this regard, I have a remark to make. It seems to be the Member State Supreme Courts, Spain, Italy, Germany, Denmark, Czech Republic, Poland, exploited the gaps left by an unjustified and poorly explained self-restraint of the European Court of Justice. In short, il peccato originale, the original flaw, is, in my opinion, lies, in my view, in the current absence of a clear view on the part of the Luxembourg Court on the constituent principles of the EU legal system. I mean, in order to avoid the departure of national courts from these principles, as interpreted by EU judges, and to contain as much as possible the activism, the rebellion of national adjudicating bodies, the Court of Justice should go back to doing what it did boldly over a long period of time, since the 60s and 70s. In other words, it should take seriously its role as a supranational quasi-constitutional court when primi inter pares constitutional principles such as primacy, direct effect, and effectiveness are at stake. EU judges, not national judges, should use their best efforts to grasp and legally frame the evolving functioning of such principle so as to avoid the risk of inconsistencies and preserve the authority of your law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniele. If I may, about the potential inversion of the simmental logic, I wouldn't stress too much that obiter dictum, and at least I would consider it as a wish, as a hope of the Constitutional Court, as it will stay to the ordinary courts to follow that strategy, and abandoning deliberately that story of judicial empowerment that the direct dialogue with the European Court of Justice allow in the last decades. So they will be, with the crooks out, choose which loyalty to prefer. But we will see in some practice, and probably
Not being followed afterwards.
we have no practice, well, at least not yet. We will see, but we will have practice in the courts, or otherwise it will remain just a hope by the Constitutional Court for its own empowerment. But sorry for this intervention, and let me give the floor to Professor Sandulli from the University Suor Orsola Benincasa in Naples, who's an administrative lawyer, and will talk about the rule of law in action in the EU, the administrative law perspective.
I'm truly honored to be here. Thank you to the Lewis University and to Professor Wouters and to the distinguished members of Reconnect Project. How has the ideal of the rule of law developed and become established in the European legal order? What role have administrative law played in shaping the European understanding of rule of law? A good starting point for an assessment of how the rule of law in Europe is developing might be the following paradox. From a certain point of view, the decision-making process of the ECJ is non-coaxial compared to the Supreme Courts of the member states. We can appreciate it in several ECJ rulings, among which the Schmidt-Berger case on the balance between freedom of expression and freedom of movement of goods, and the Viking, Laval, Ruffert, and other cases which concern, as is known, the social dumping. These cases have shown that the European institutions and the ECJ are by nature inclined to primarily protect economic freedoms rather than individual and social rights. At the same time, we must admit that the EU rule of law is an efficient protective shield to identify the breaking points of common constitutional traditions of the member states, for instance, Poland and Hungary cases. So the seeming paradox is that the rule of law traditional Western democracies went evolving and changing within the European legal order, but the European rule of law always remains a strong protection against attempts to weaken its substantial strength. If we want to go to the root of this dilemma, we have to take the steps from the distinction between the modern state and the postmodern European legal system. A major distinction concerns the nature of the institutions, namely the composite and diarchic nature of the European legal order based on the dissolution of the state experience within the new paradigm of diffused or multi-level governance. But there is also a second distinction, which until now has not been adequately highlighted, and which concerns the distinct genetic heritage of the European supranational order compared to that of the modern state. The modern state came into being with its own legal and philosophical genetic heritage. By the 17th and 18th century, law, together with philosophy, was already an ancient and established social science. On the contrary, the genome of the European supranational horde is made up of a multiplicity of chromosomes. By the mid-20th century, in addition to law, a series of other social sciences, such as economics, sociology, political science, and statistics, had already come of age. The European Union, therefore, is an original system, not only by virtue of its supranational and composite nature, but also because it is built upon a plurality of social science methods. Of these, under functional method, the economic methods and themes has held a position of particular importance, focusing especially on economic and technical bureaucratic profiles at the European level. So, the new European rule of law, born already hybrid, its legitimacy comes not only from its auctoritas, formally valid legislative law, but also and above all from its ratio, the substantive and procedural rights and principle of justice. The fundamental transition that has taken place is from Rechtsstaat to the community of law, based on the rule of law and defined by the Court of Justice via integration through law, and indicating the mixture resulting from the European treaties and the general principle of the system as identified by the Court. But it is a way of doing law that was born hybrid, above all on account of its dual genetic heritage. It is a model created on European functionalist lines, developed in the market, for the market, largely using economic methods. And after an initial period of equilibrium, in the last 25 years, the economy has assumed a dominant role. The hallmark of the evolution that has taken place in the European legal order is the fact that economic method has broken into the legal sphere through a process of juridification, and the law has been exploited as an infrastructure to disseminate it throughout the legal system. Managerial precepts have been translated into legal principles, and this juridification, focusing on economic rationality, has transformed the subject matter and the concept of rule of law. In this respect, it is interesting to ask whether, especially after the serious economic crisis of 2008, the European fiscal rule within the EU system have now become elements of the rule of law of the European Union, given that they bind the governments of the member states. This leads to the issue of the technical expertise of the epistemic communities, bureaucrats with high levels of technical knowledge who take decisions within the European institutional system. While guaranteeing a high level of technical performance, this model of post-national democracy raises problems regarding the lack of political and democratic legitimacy and the lack of adequate checks to balance this ontological weakness. European spillover was based in functional terms on the neutrality of the technical decision maker, relying on output legitimacy as technocratic legitimacy has been defined. This, of course, favored the emergence of administrative law, which found a favorable environment in which to evolve and adapt. We lack the space here to examine the ample debate on the so-called democratic deficit, where two opposing views come into conflict. On the one hand, Peter Linzat's argument that the European governance is eminently administrative in nature. The consequence is that the European institution made up of bodies of bureaucrats with technical training are delegated by the member states. And the member states are the only subject with democratic legitimacy, politically referable to the electorate, the so-called input democracy, to exercise regulatory power and to carry out tasks of social and economic regulation. This vision implies the abandonment of the constitutional inspiration of the European order. The second thesis, illustrated among others by the Descartes, is based on the composite nature of the European order and on the gradual construction of a living European constitution. So actions favoring European integration are sedimented and added together, as happens between different geological layers. This second idea of the European legal order, as progressively evolving phenomenon, could pave the way for the introduction of instruments aiming to reconnect citizens with political decision-making processes at the European level, and that would include democratic legitimacy of a political nature. From this point of view, administrative law can be used as a basis for a renewed impetus for European constitutional law. The construction of a new institutional and political structure for the Union is not reasonably possible without the decisive contribution of constitutional law. This combination of administrative and constitutional law could bring beneficial effects, especially on the most controversial point in the European agenda, the development of European solidarity policies. Policies of cohesion and cooperation appear not to have worked, but it may also be argued that for the future of Europe, investment in solidarity, the protection of social rights, and the redistribution of wealth could also be a winning choice from the utilitarian Bentamian perspective. The way forward in this direction seems to be to strengthen cooperation between a small and cohesive group of countries in a union that cannot only be economic, but also constitutional and political. Hence, the onerous task of reconstructing European rule of law, which consists primarily in claiming the wealth of substantive content back to the legal sphere. We are witnessing a disturbing period in the application of the rule of law, in which we see formally non-legal norms endowed with real normative scope, and on the contrary, formally legal standards with dubious material normativity. It is therefore necessary to go back to the roots of European rule of law, emphasizing once more the extrinsic and intrinsic aims of the law. A concept of law rich in substance, one that avoids isolation and relegation to the role of mere infrastructure. I'm moving to the conclusion. In practical terms, in what directions can we work to build up a different structure for the European legal order? From the administrative law standpoint, there are basically two ways forward. On the one hand, there is administrative procedure. A positive move would be to adopt an European Administrative Procedure Act based on those already in place in the vast majority of member states. Although many principles and rules for administrative action have been drawn up in European case law, it is significant that the decisions of the European institution based on technical expertise are often marked by opacity in terms of mechanisms for fair procedure, due process, and transparency. The second area to work on might be the way decisions are made. Procedural aspect must go hand in hand with substantive ones as far as the content of public decision is concerned. From this point of view, the principle of proportionality is of huge importance for all the technical work carried out by the European institutions, and in particular for the regulation of the financial markets. The decision taken at European level must guarantee the least possible sacrifice for the holders of conflicting public and private interests. However, it would be a mistake to think that the acts adopted by the European institutions should simply be the result of the balance between the interests of member states in substantive and procedural terms. Administrative law alone is not enough. Constitutional law and the adoption of common policies are also required. This means intervening in the distribution of competencies and institutional structure, the most delicate part on the integration process. Enhanced cooperation could allow the implementation of common policies in the fields of taxation and banking, but it is above all through the revitalization of policies fostering solidarity and the management of borders that the ability to reconnect the European institutions with their citizens will come about. From these actions, European citizens will be able to appreciate once again the importance of a shared sense of belonging to this particular legal system. Without forgetting, as we already said, that the European institutions and the Court of Justice are not only different manifestations of how the rule of law has developed, but they also constitute a shield protecting the foundations of the European rule of law, both in the legal system of the member states and in international organizations. Defense of the substantial rule of law and democratic structure based on checks and balances is the most important legacy of the past to be defended in order to guarantee the citizens of Europe a solid future. To this end, it is to be hoped that the law, not seen in the merely formal or instrumental sense, will gain primacy in the European order once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and now I just leave the floor to Professor Bernardo Giorgio Mattarella, administrative lawyer, professor of administrative law here in Lewis, about strengthening authority in the EU, access and transparency make the EU a win-win game.
Thank you, Giovanni. In the title of my contribution, as you heard, there is a question mark, and the answer is yes, but. The question is, access and transparency make the EU a win-win game. Well, this is probably too big a goal for access and transparency alone, but of course they can help. If our purpose is to strengthen the legitimacy of European institutions, of course, transparency is a useful tool. Of course, access and transparency are an instruments which makes public institutions accountable, strengthens the relationship between institutions and citizens, and so on. This happens all over the world. There is a general trend in the Western world in strengthening the legislation, giving rights to be informed to the citizens. To the citizens as parties in certain decision-making procedures, and to the citizens as such, just because they, as citizens, have the right to have certain information. This is obvious, but it is all the more true probably for the European Union, because for the European Union, citizens have a big problem of information that we perceive every day in the public debate about the European Union, which, for example, in Italy in this time is perceived as the guys who control the state budget and who do not do enough for immigration. But probably, and this is also a problem for democracy. We will have we will elect the European Parliament in a few months. What are we voting for? Are the people informed enough about what decisions will be made by the next Parliament, by the next Commission? Do people really know what the European institutions do for the quality of water that we drink, or the food that we eat, for the quality of the air that we breathe, for the cost of our telephone calls, for the safety of our transport systems, for the inflation and so on? Probably the European institutions' activity needs to be better known, and of course transparency is an important tool. But Having said so, which is quite obvious, we have to make some distinctions. When we talk about transparency, we always have to make distinctions. What kind of transparency? Are we talking about transparency in the decision-making processes, or are we talking about transparency as general information about what European institutions do, what is the outcome of the European institution activity? Do we talk about transparency in favor of the single person which is involved in a administrative procedure, or are we talking about transparency for citizens as such, because they have the right to be informed according to the Freedom of Information Act legislation, which is spreading all over the Western world? If we look at the law in force in the European Union concerning administrative transparency, we have very broad provisions concerning transparency. The problem of transparency in the European Union, as it is well known, started in the early 90s, especially after some northern European countries posed the problem of administrative transparency, and then we had a code of conduct, a regulation dating back to 2001, which is quite restrictive, but has been interpreted and implemented in quite broad terms. And then there are some primary law provisions which are very broad. Article 1 of the Treaty of the European Union talks about an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, in which decisions are taken as openly as possible. So here we have transparency in decision-making process for all the citizens. But then there are the provisions of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 41, which confers the right of access to documents of the institution, the right of every person to have access to his or her file in administrative procedures, and Article 42, which confers the right of access to documents of the institutions, bodies, offices and agencies of the Union, whatever their medium, and including right of access in electronic forms and so on. So we have all the different kinds of transparency for individual parties and for all citizens in the decision-making process and in the general and not for the general outcome of what European Union does. And we have, and this principle of transparency has become a fundamental principle of European administrative law, which is which is influenced, which is had quite a certain influence on the legal system of member states, on the case law of national administrative courts. So we can certainly say that the principle of transparency, in broad terms, is a part of the common constitutional heritage of the member states. How about the implementation? How about the practice of transparency in the European Union? Well, there are relatively few requests for documents to the European institutions. Putting together the Parliament, Council of Ministers, Commissions, we have probably less than 10,000 requests of access to documents per year, which is very little compared to national administrations. And these requests are made mainly by strongly organized interests, not so much by common citizens. So we have transparency is actually used in the European Union more as an instrument to take part to decision-making processes, not so much as an instrument for informing the general public. This is what probably we need to enforce. The information, transparency as an instrument of information for the broad public, for all the people, is probably what is still missing. What is not enough, probably there is much more can be done by the European institutions and by the national administrations concerning their involvement in the European governance. Transparency can be an instrument for strengthening the accountability of European institutions, but with transparency probably we can be aware also of the problems, like the Scottish case mentioned by Professor Amato this morning, but what needs to be corrected in the European legislation, in the European decision-making processes. And probably, well, maybe in the case of Scotland, the problem was that the Scottish government, the Scottish administration had not correctly taken part in the decision-making processes, which is something which often happens for the Italian administration. And so transparency at the European level can be also an instrument to see how, to verify how national administrations take part in the European decision-making process. Nevertheless, we should take into account the peculiarity of European administration, which is much different from national administrations. First, European administration is far, and of course, what Professor Amato was saying this morning is true. The problem is not distance. I'm afraid that in this case, at an administrative level, the distance counts a little bit, because when we talk about access to administrative documents, well, there is a difference between national administrations which have local offices, which can be the interface of citizens requiring access, and the European administration, where, well, when you walk around in the European streets, you never meet a European officer or a European office, or the building of a European office, unless in certain capital of member states. And so there is a problem of distance, there is a problem of dimension. We cannot manage, the European Union cannot manage the request for access the same way that national administrations manage. There is the number of people counts as well, the dimension counts. And so I would not stress, and this is the conclusion of my intervention, transparency at the European Union level must be different, a little bit different from transparency in national member states. Transparency in national member states can be enforced through the right of access of individuals, which gives quite some problems at the national administrations level and also at the European administration level. Of course, the right of access to administrative documents is important as an instrument of participation in decision-making at the European level too. But what we lack and what needs to be enforced in the European administration is transparency as an instrument to inform, transparency as information for the general public, rather than transparency as an instrument of protection of the individual. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have the last speaker of the panel before the discussant and the discussion. And the floor is for Julien Navarro, who's a professor of political sciences in the Catholic University of Lille. And he will give us a bridge also to the second session, discussing the electoral accountability and EU authority, the case of European Parliament election. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking everyone, and especially the organizers, for inviting me to give this talk this morning. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted also that I have the challenging task to keep everyone concentrated when every stomach is starting to cry for food. the other reason why I'm so pleased to be here is that the topic that we have to discuss, to reconceptualize authority and legitimacy in the EU. This is very challenging, and I hope that I will not bring more confusion to this complicated discussion by adding one more concept. Indeed, what I want to suggest in this talk is that we need the concept of accountability in order to tackle this problem of the connection between the EU and its citizens. And this is what I want to develop now, but let me first stress that these are only preliminary thoughts, and also that my conclusion will not be a policy recommendation, but rather what I want to do as a member of the Reconnect Project is also kind of give some ideas about our research agenda. Although the project is already well started, I think it's still necessary to clarify what we are doing. So I'm also speaking as a member of the project and to the colleagues involved into the project. Having said that, I will take the question of the democratic deficit as my starting point. Of course, much ink has been spilled on this topic. I will not address it in all its dimensions, but my understanding of it is that from a formal perspective, there is probably no such democratic deficit. There are many chains of delegation from the citizens to the EU institutions, and in fact, some colleagues have even argued that there is no democratic deficit, but instead some form of democratic surplus. Are we happy with this? I don't think so, right? There is still a problem, and the problem lies, of course, in the distrust that we can see from the citizens, in not only the distrust, but also maybe the opposition, the hostility towards the EU, its institutions, the politicians, etc., etc. And my claim here is that the concept of accountability might be useful to address this very specific dimension, but very crucial as well. Accountability, the word has been used several times this morning, or as an adjective, accountable. I think it has two sides. There are two sides to this concept. It can be simply defined as a situation in which one institution or someone is responsible for things that happen and can give some reason for it, or for taking some decisions. So it means answerability, blameworthiness, liability, the expectation of account giving, and some institutions are necessary for this to take place. We just heard about transparency, which is key in this case. But accountability is also the degree to which this actually happens. And this ultimately depends on the sanction reward mechanism that takes place within the political system. It means that the institutions are actually being held accountable. And in a democracy, it does not only depend on the agent, in this case the institutions, to be transparent or to act in a certain manner, or to give reasons for what they do, but it also depends, ultimately, on the citizens, on the principle. And this is why I think it is important in trying to understand this problem, to address accountability in its different dimensions. So, to sum up, accountability is not only about principles or institutional design, but we must look at the practice of it, and we should focus both on political actors and on citizens. So this was for a general presentation of the concept of accountability. Let us now move back to the EU and accountability in the EU. Of course, there is much to be said about this. I will concentrate on one aspect of it. I will concentrate on the European Parliament elections. This was promised in the title of my presentation. So, well, I'm totally conscious that the problem of accountability in the EU goes much beyond the question of EP elections, but still I think that EP elections are very relevant because they are at the heart of the question of the relationship between the citizens and the EU. I would like to remind you that in democratic systems, elections are not only about delegation of power, of giving a mandate, but they are also, to some extent, about accountability and controlling holders of power. This point was emphasized by several scholars, amongst them Bernard Manin, who stressed that when we think of representation, we think not only of election, but the repetition of election, which is what makes accountability effective, at least theoretically. So the question becomes, do the elections to the European Parliament provide the citizens with a satisfactory tool to create accountability? And do they actually use this tool to hold the EU accountable? So, again, if we look at the first dimension of accountability, the EP is, in a sense, very accountable, and maybe even more than any other EU institutions, because decisions are quite transparent. It's easy to know what is going on within the European Parliament. Most of the debates are taking place in public. You can find the registers of what is going on, follow the amendments. So there is a lot of accountability in this sense. But of course, we know that there are also problems, both in the setup of the institutions, but also in the process as it takes place from the side of the citizens. There is in the EU no real government, no real majority to be held accountable. And I think this is one aspect of the question that we are thinking about, or that we are discussing now when we talk about authority and legitimacy. It is not so clear for the citizen's perspective of where the authority is, who is doing what. Second, as you know, EP elections have been described as second-order elections, meaning that much focus is put on the national level and not so much on what is going on at the EU level. Of course, this is a reality, but I also think that if we look at this question, things are quite complex, because I would tend to think that there are also, EP elections are also used as a channel to send a message to the government about its EU policies. It is not totally true that EU questions are absent from the debate, but this is, of course, only an hypothesis. Because when we look at the debates, the discussions that take place at the time of the European election, well, it seems that much emphasis from the side of the voters or even the commentators, the media, is put on the question of more or less EU integration. But this is probably not the right time to ask these questions, because EU elections are about electing the European Parliament, which has no power in giving more or less power to the EU. So there is a kind of a reversal in the sense that probably the EP election is much more about deciding about what we have been hearing about this morning, what kind of economic policy should the EU have, international trade, or these kind of issues, and not only or not so much about the fate of EU integration as such. So there is this complexity that takes place, and that to some extent limits the way accountability works in the EU. So I want to conclude now. My conclusion, in fact, is twofold. First of all, I would like to come back to this very nice quotation of Simone Weil that Professor Wouters showed us this morning. If you remember, the idea was that the legitimacy, the electoral legitimacy, the popular legitimacy of the European Parliament will give it a huge authority. Well, the problem that we are now facing is that if you don't have this electoral legitimacy, in a sense that participation in the election is very low, and that maybe the right questions are not discussed at the time of the election, then you might have also the opposite effect, that in fact the lack of legitimacy also creates a problem of authority at the EU level, and in this case, especially for the European Parliament. The second part of my conclusion, which is not so much about, again, policy recommendations, but suggestions. First, to sum up, I think that I insisted already a lot that we should be attentive to accountability mechanisms, not only from attentive to the formal mechanisms that take place, but also at the practice of it. And just to mention that I am in charge within the project Reconnect of a work package which is called Democracy in Practice of Democracy. So that's why I'm putting so much emphasis on practices. And I also think that if we look at accountability, we should see this as a two-way process, looking from the institutions towards the citizens and from the citizens to the institutions. How can we do this? Two ideas, again, from some of the research that is already starting within the project Reconnect. One is on the question of responsiveness of the MEPs. How do they view the functioning of the legislative process? How do they communicate about what they do to the citizens? I think this is part of this accountability question. And the way around, how are the citizens using this opportunity to hold the EU institutions accountable? Just to give one illustration of the kind of questions that we need to ask. With some colleagues, we are now doing some research on the electoral turnout in EP elections, and to what extent it is connected with satisfaction, it is connected to satisfaction with democracy, both at the national and the EU level. How people feel about democracy nationally and in the EU, and how this has an impact on participation turnout in EP elections. So these are only, of course, very general ideas, and I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you also for recalling the really inspirational quote of Simone Weil. If I may, we could probably think about the parallel between the quote of Simone Weil of the fact that, notwithstanding the limit of the attribution of the European Parliament, the political authority deriving from the election will push the European Parliament to be a protagonist. The parallel can be made with the famous declaration by Draghi on the day of the quantitative easing that also Professor Amato recalled. And probably we also always pay attention on the second part. We will do, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. But actually, even that declaration was opened within our mandate. So, whereas for the European Parliament, the institutional limitation shouldn't be a limit to use the political authority, for the ECB, the limit of the mandate is something absolute, what should be, at least from our point of view, should be an absolute limit to do whatever it takes to accomplish the institutional mission. But let me open the discussion, and I would ask Christina as a discussant to break the ice. So let me give the floor to Dr. Cristina Fazzone, who is a constitutional law, comparative constitutional law scholar from Lewis.
Thanks very much, Giovanni, and thanks very much to all the panelists for really their great presentations. It's not easy, of course, to combine my comments on all the many insights that they've given. What I will try to do is to start from the working definition of authority that Professor Wouters gave us this morning to see how gradually it has been refined through the presentation, both in the vertical and horizontal dimension. So, and I will try also to pose a few questions to the speakers. So the starting point is the definition of authority as delegated, as a way to delegate competence to exercise powers. And Joseph very clearly highlighted already in the first minutes of his presentation that there are, however, some conditions for this authority to be legitimate, of course. So it's a constituted power. It's a public power that is constitutionalized, but that has some constraints in order to be deployed in a legitimate way. He could not elaborate much also on how this works in an interdependent system. So it will be important, I think, for us to hear also this part possibly in the time for discussion. But I was wondering whether important is also how this delegation happened to take place. So the process leading to the constitution of public powers, I think it's quite important both at national level, so who participated, but also at supranational level, given the fact that, at least in theory, the power of the European Union derives from the member states, and we know how the treaty-making process typically takes place beyond the convention method that is now enshrined in the treaties. Then we move to the presentation of Daniele Gallo, which gave us, in the particular EU context, very important insights on the limits of the principle of conferral. That is to say that the principle of conferral is just a starting point to see where authority is allocated between the European Union and the member states. There are further elements to be taken into account. And so the practice and how the interpretation of the treaties developed is quite an important point, both by the Court of Justice, but of course also by other actors. And then this kind of resentment coming up from the member states to this maybe process of overstretching the letter of the treaty, which, however, is quite broad, I mean, in terms of formulation. So this purposive interpretation, in particular by the Court of Justice, has triggered some resistance by courts. And I wanted to ask him about a specific point which was raised in the presentation when Daniele says that to some extent the practice could be seen as ultra vires or perceived as ultra vires. So how do you combine this problem of the limitation of competence, which have been interpreted in a very extensive way based on the objectives enshrined in the treaties, with the limits of EU authority? Regarding the solution proposed, that is a more clear way for the Court of Justice to identify the structural principle, would you say that this is a process that can be led in a dialogical way with national courts, or, I mean, given the political times in which we live, is it appropriate maybe to be more, a bit more open to also national courts, because in the end, they are the primary actors in the implementation of EU law. We moved also to the horizontal dimension of authority in the EU. And I think the remarks of Professor Sandulli about the nature of this authority, is it administrative, is it a constitutional authority, are very, very important. We know that Peter Lindstedt has this specific view on the which lies in the weak democratic credentials of the EU that justify, and also in the powers it has that justifies its description as an administrative process of integration. I was wondering whether the way out, as I understood, is to provide the EU with more constitutional powers in some key areas. However, at the same time, we have to face a European Union which is increasingly diverse, maybe enlarged in the near future. So we see these days a lot of discussion going on about differentiated disintegration as well, not just as member states' withdrawal from the Union, but withdrawal of a member state from selected policies. So basically has to have a federal core of Europe on some policy area, in particular the internal market, and then grouping of states that can cooperate closely in certain areas, whereas others remain asked to retain the powers formerly delegated. So how would this be consistent with this constitutional impetus of the Union if we move forward in this direction of differentiated integration and maybe also disintegration? The very interesting presentation of Professor Mattarella, who also emphasized more maybe the horizontal side, although comparing the level of transparency and access to information between the member states and the European Union. Here, I think very important is the fact that access to information is perceived in the EU policy making just as a further tool to participate rather as an added value for the addressees of the policies to gain information. I see, however, that on some occasions the level of access to information and the transparency of the EU has been remarkable compared to the member states. And here I'm thinking of a specific case, so my perception might be biased. But for example, in the negotiation of international agreements, the European Parliament managed to reach a level of information obtained, which is very, very high compared to what national parliaments could normally do in this particular field. So, of course, with some limitation linked to the specific nature of the policy-making process when you negotiate international agreements. So we actually witness national parliaments trying to get in touch with the European Parliament in order to get information from it and being more able to understand what was going on. So I think it's very important also to see when access to information and transparency can really be strengthened, because it depends a lot on the policy area or the specific policy-making process we are looking at. So transparency, access to information maybe are not values in themselves, but should be maybe tailored to the specific policy-making process going on. And also key is to see when transparency is or should be enhanced. Again, I think a key moment will be the moment in which decisions on authority are taken, so on how to allocate authority, such as in the treaty-making process, for example. And then the very interesting presentation of Julian on trying to link the dimension of authority to the dimension of accountability, and in particular electoral accountability. Here I see that the main problem is maybe a problem of communication, especially towards the end. You were emphasizing that the communication is problematic, both from the European Parliament as an institution, but also from the individual MPs in terms of responsiveness towards their voters. There are special dynamics of government going on at European level that are difficult to compare with the member states. But I was wondering I mean, whether we could completely disregard also, as you emphasize practice, the way the European Parliament has managed to conclude the interinstitutional agreements, including the ECB, for example, in order to scrutinize the activity of these maybe less democratic institutions. Is it not optimal? But I see here a positive trend. And also one question that came up in my mind while you were talking, as you stress electoral accountability, I was thinking whether it plays any role the fact that the European Parliament is possibly the only parliament in the Union which cannot be dissolved before ends. So it stays, once elected, it stays 5 years, and there's no way to dissolve and for the voters to, be called to the polls and elect new representatives. Do you think this is something that plays a role in your picture? And I finish here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cristina Fazones, for being punctual, both from in terms of content and in terms of timely exposition. And I would give the floor to the presenters for replies. But I would ask whether there are questions. I'm afraid we can accept no more than 2, like in the first section. But I'd like to have one. Please, Una, thank you. There's one back there.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm James Wilhelm, by the way. I'm working on Work Package 9 on the running the data collection for the European Parliament survey. My question is for Julian, actually. I thought it was a very prescient point you made about the European Parliament elections not being about giving more or less power to the EU. It's not about whether to slow down integration or push it further. That's not the issue at stake. It's about these other policy issues. And it certainly is. But my sort of, from the literature, what I understand is voters do tend to use this as an opportunity to say what they want about European integration, even if that's slightly misguided. So what I was wondering is, within your sort of concept of accountability, how does that fit into it? Is that accountability at all, if that's actually what's going on? Or is that, how does that fit into the overall scheme? Just to bring some sort of data to the table, I know for the last European Parliament election with the Spitzenkandidat system, I think only about 5% of voters actually knew who the Spitzenkandidaten were, right? So at the voter level, we're dealing with very low level of knowledge, and it's difficult to really, if voters don't know, then they can't engage in the systems that are designed there. So yeah, I'd like to hear just some thoughts from you on how it fits in.
Thank you. One more question, maybe? Okay. Dimitri, please.
It's not a question, it's probably a remark.
Use the microphone, please.
To Professor Sandulli mostly. We tend to criticize the market when somehow we are the losing side, but there is also a winning side which can have a different perspective. So as someone born in the Soviet Union and also a fan of Damian Kukowicz's work on the periphery in the EU, I tend to regard the cases that you cited as negative examples of how the market works as positive examples, because if you're a Slovene or a Pole, you have nothing else but the cheap cost of your labor. So if you want to equalize the level of socioeconomic development in Europe, you have to actually open up to the possibility of benefiting mutually from what the free movement of persons, free movement of freedom of establishment and other things offer. That's why actually Laval and Viking could be regarded in a radically different light. And this is what Kukovets does in several brilliant publications. Just a small note.
Thank you. I will follow the same order for the replies. And so, Professor Joseph Corkin.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Christina. I just wanted to pick up on the one remark that you made on that connection between authority within constraint and how does it connect to interdependence. What I wanted to do, illustrating with the example of the historical example of the king, is this idea that the law makes the king, the law makes the sovereign body, and then the body itself seeks a manner of legitimating itself beyond that. So it claims, in nowadays, it claims to be legitimated because it embodies the democratic self-determination of a political community. Now, the connection that I sought to make with interdependence or the factual interdependence of globalization is that imposes a self-constraint on that political community, because if the claim of the sovereign body of the political that represents or embodies that political community is a democratic claim, it claims to embody that democratic self-determination. If there are external effects of that national democratic self-determination on parallel political projects of parallel political communities who also claim their legitimacy from a democratic self-determination, then the supranational claim to authority over and above that is that it lies in that democratic claim, that democratic self-determining claim, because what it's doing is it's managing these bordered political communities that each make a claim to their bordering through democracy as projects of self-determination. And that then links to what Giuliano Amato said earlier about this idea of respect for the nation state. So he was talking in terms of this sort of idea of less is more, recognizing a margin of appreciation or flexibility or national identity. And that demands respect for the historical contingency of the nation state. It's the level at which we as European citizens, as peoples of Europe, feel comfortable organizing ourselves democratically at the moment, more so than we do at the European level. And that demands of the European level a certain amount of respect. It demands also a certain degree of management as well. And that is this link between law and politics as a means of managing the European political order, that it has to operate through law, but at the same time it has to recognize the political as well. And then you get into the sort of dual supranationalism and so on. But I would ground the project itself in democracy and then start from there. That's why, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Professor Daniele Gallo.
Grazie, Giovanni. Thank you very much, Cristina. As always, your insights are very interesting. I mean, one thing is acting ultra vires, and my understanding is that the ECJ generally is not doing so. A different thing is stepping in areas that are at the crossroads between member states' competence and European Union competence, as in the case of fundamental rights, without elaborating on the path that leads the European Court of Justice to take a certain stance, a position. Well, two examples that may illustrate the divide between how was the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and how is right now. These two examples have to do with direct effect. I mean, direct effect is about individuals. It's put individuals at the center of the whole legal discourse. It's about legitimacy, right? That's the revolution brought about by Van Gandelos and those rulings. Well, with Van Gandelos and other rulings, the Court of Justice, thanks to a purposive interpretation of the law, grasped rights from provisions that are formally deprived of that nature. And that's been a very important step. Example of what the Court of Justice did boldly in the 60s, 70s. Well, the other example nowadays, think of the stances of the European Court of Justice on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, whether the Charter produces horizontal direct effect or vertical direct effect. Was this the difference between principles and rules as foreseen in the Charter? Well, I mean, the argument is that in the mesh of self-restraint, judicial activism and even rebellion on the part of member states' courts may arise, and as Mauro Cappelletti, for instance, talked us and wrote about.
Thank you, and Professor Aldo Sandulli.
Thank you. First of all, I agree to Professor Kochenov. The opposition between Schmidberger and Poland and Hungary cases is just a seeming paradox, and I try to stress this sort of asymmetry. We are here to reconnect the citizens. This means that at the moment we think that we have a sort of disconnection, but I agree with your remark. We have to start to the observation that we usually speak of diffuse governance, multi-level governance, and an intergovernmental model. And it's too simply, it's a simplification, because we are now in a sort of multi-speeds models, diffused, federalist, intergovernmental, it's a community sometimes, or a condominium in other times. So I think that sort of next step, a constitutional direction for the integration process could be an enhanced cooperation between little number of member states, and obviously we need to balance technical expertise and political powers on the one side, and on the other side, as Professor Amato said this morning, give more important competencies to the European Parliament. And we need perhaps give more discretionary powers to the administrative institutions and less rules, hard and soft rules. I agree with the thesis of the Descartes that the composite nature of the European order and the gradual construction of a living European constitution. Fragmentation and institutional pluralism are ontologically part of the European order and derive from the high degree of conflicts that arise from the multiplicity and diversity of the institutional actors and the interests at stake. Let me clarify the relationship between administrative law and constitutional law. We have said that the functional progressive development of the European order and the development, above all, of technical and economic skills, leaving politics mostly to national states, as leads to problems for the development of European constitutional law. On the other hand, the European administrative law has, so to speak, been quite at home, encountering few obstacles in its path. Today, this is no longer enough. The two-way process of constitutionalizing administrative law and administrativizing constitutional law, which began and has developed in Europe itself, calls for a joint analysis of administrative law and constitutional law. And in conclusion, what is needed is a return to the constitutional period, to the innermost meaning of integration through law, to the original post-war period when law, politics, and economics merged in an efficacious union, a return to the 1944 Philadelphia Declaration, the expression as an appendix to the horrors of the Second World War, of the will to construct a new international order based on law and justice and the protection of fundamental rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now the floor to Professor Bernardo Giorgio Mattarella.
Thank you. I have very little to reply because I agree upon Christina's remarks, including the fact that in the European Union there are very good practices of transparency, as for the case of international agreement negotiations, which are usually, where transparency is usually an instrument, a right to take part in decision-making processes, which is a kind of transparency that European administration needs as well as national administrations. What the European Union needs more than member states is informing the general public about how European policies affect their daily life. There, I think, much more could be done.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Julian Navarro.
Yes, thank you for the comments and the questions. Well, I very much agree with you that this is what I've been discussing is very much about a communication and a communication problem. In fact, I think it goes even beyond that. I think what we have to look at is some kind of cognitive constraints that apply to the actors that we are dealing with, both at the EU level, I mean, the institutional actors, but also, again, the citizens and the voters. And in fact, a lot of the things that we are discussing here are kind of more or less clear to us, the institutions, the concepts, and the references to the, I don't know, constitutional principles. But we have to realize, and this is maybe the question of reconnecting again, but this time reconnecting us with, you know, what is going on in the real world, that this understanding of the problems and the concepts can be very, very different. And I think that, I mean, in reply to the remark on the question of issues during the EP elections, I fully agree. Yes, this is, I mean, we have to take this as something which is given to us and to analyze, and we cannot escape this reality. That was actually my point. That we may have, I don't know, from a legal, from a political, institutional perspective, some understanding of who is doing what in the EU and at the national level. But if the voters, and to some extent also the politicians, because if you look at the electoral campaign, you will see a lot of promises on, you know, we want some EU like this or like that coming from the parties. Well, we have to deal with this reality and not maybe kind of, you know, forget about it. Just to give one small illustration, if I can conclude on this, thinking of also of Giuliano Amato, who was here when he was co-chairing the convention on the future of Europe. I was doing my PhD and fieldwork in the European Parliament, asking MEPs about their vision, you know, for the future of Europe. And I was very surprised, to say the least, that many of them, especially French MEPs, I should say, told me that, you know, what they really wanted was ultimately, you know, the ideal should be to have a president of the European Commission directly elected by the citizens. Fair enough. But as it wasn't possible at this stage, it should be elected by the European Parliament. Well, I think from a constitutional perspective, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but these are two completely different systems, right? One is a parliamentary system, another one is a presidential system. But obviously, for many MEPs involved in the very process of drafting a European constitution, the distinction was not so clear. So this is something we have to take into account when we discuss these questions of what the actors see and how they understand the situation. So this is my reply to the question of communication. I think it goes even deeper. Thank you.
Thank you all. And just two information, we have lunch downstairs in the faculty restaurant, and the second panel will start at 2 in the same room. Thank you all.